Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Walking Through the Scriptures with Joseph Bahota. I'm your host, Joe Bahota, and walking through the Scriptures. And I got a good one for you today. I've indirectly talked about this before when basically Paula White was in the White House originally in 2016, and now she's in the White House again in 2024. And as we're going on here and through 2025, because she's basically President Trump's spiritual advisor. And all the bad stuff that came with that, and Paula White being a false teacher. I also did another video about Lance Wallnau and how he basically got out, once he left Daystar, now he's on the Trump train. And I showed you a video where basically he believes that Trump is going to bring in this, he calls it the third wave or the third revival. They believe Trump is like, they're Cyprus, they're spiritual Messiah, secular Messiah, but still Messiah nonetheless. Of how, God is going to use Trump as the secular Messiah to basically bring the Christians into the rightful place in the world, which he calls like the third awakening or the third revival. Lance Wallnau does. And so I showed you the clip when I did that video on Lance Wallnau. I showed you all that. Well, there's a guy here. His name is Matthew Taylor, I believe. Matthew D. Taylor. And he has a book, by the way. Let me go ahead and just share screen so you know who he is and what I'm talking about. If you can see this, it says here, The Violent Take It by Force by Matthew D. Taylor. I'm going to include the link to this book. Now, I've not read this book yet, but I know of the book. And thank you for Pastor Collins giving me, David Collins, this link to this book, but also the link to this interview. It says, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy, written by Matthew D. Taylor. Okay. And so anyway, in this next one I'm going to share with you, Matthew D. Taylor got interviewed. And he talked about how people like Paula White, and once she got into office in 2016, how basically she basically introduced Trump to all her friends, which are false teachers. And a lot of them were the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation denominations, which is what Bill Johnson is, and Bethel Church down there and all that in Redding, California. So she brought in her NAR people and Lance Wallnau and all that kind of stuff. And again, they're big proponents of what Peter Wagner used to teach, the 7 mountain mandates, how Christians need to rule and reign in the 7 mountains. And one of the mountains is politics. So this is why they're pushing Trump so hard. But I never had a person just link all the dots for me and put it all together and say, this is what they're doing and this is why. Well, Matthew D. Taylor does. And so he gets in. I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm going to show you that this interview is amazing. It's just, when I listened to it, just blew my mind. Up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Matthew D. Taylor. And it says how evangelical Christianity became a threat to American democracy with Dr. Matthew D. Taylor. This is from Faithful Politics Podcast. Again, I don't know this guy from Adam, but this was sent to me. And I'm going to fast forward to like the 42-minute mark, because that's when he starts talking about Paula White and how Paula White came in there in 2016, and this whole thing started back in 2016, and how we got to where we are today, and basically how it led to the January 6th, insurrection and all of that. It's because of stuff like this. So anyway, I'm just going to let it play, and I'm just going to interject here and there. But unfortunately, this is about 25 minutes, so it is long. I'm just going to interject here and there. And I'm just going to let this guy cook, because this guy's good.
And Donald Trump, after he rides down the golden escalator in June of 2015 and declares his presidential candidacy, turns to one of his closest friends, a woman named Paula White Cain. And Paula White Cain is a televangelist. She's a megachurch pastor. She's an apostle. And she's an independent, charismatic prosperity gospel preacher. And Trump asks her if she will be his liaison to evangelicals. Will she be in charge of reaching out to evangelicals? Now, the challenge is Paula White Cain is not a conventional evangelical. She's a fourth quadrant evangelical. And so she starts reaching out to the people that she knows. And in the fall of 2015.
Now he breaks it down into the fourth quadrants. That's further on earlier in the video. I'm not going to go through all that. But he's basically going to say now, Paula White starts inviting all of her friends.
You start to have a series of gatherings with Donald Trump as the candidate, with these independent charismatic leaders that Paula White has gathered. And in those meetings is one Lance Wallnau, Mr. 7 Mountains. And Lance Wallnau, on his second meeting.
See, Mr. 7 Mountains, the 7 mountain mandate, which he originally got from Peter Wagner, because, we're going to rule, meaning we Christians are going to rule America through the 7 mountains. Okay. And this is 2016. This is when it all got started.
with Donald Trump to his face, says, I have a prophecy for you. And the prophecy is that you are an Isaiah 45 Cyrus. And if that reference doesn't mean anything to you, that what he's saying there is Cyrus was this ancient Persian emperor in the 6th century BCE, who was the one who was responsible for sending the Jewish people back from exile to go and rebuild Jerusalem. And so what Wallnau is saying is that Donald Trump is like Cyrus. He's an outsider who God can use. And in Isaiah chapter 45, God speaks about Cyrus as an anointed one, a Mashiach in Hebrew. This is where we get the term Messiah. And so Cyrus is a sort of secular Messiah for the Jewish people. And Wallnau is saying Donald Trump can be a sort of secular Messiah for American Christians.
See, there you go. That's where you get it. Lance Wallnau, the New Apostolic Reformation, the Seven Mountains, false teaching. This was back in 2016, guys. They believe Trump is their secular Messiah that's going to allow Christians to rule and reign and be in control of everything because they're part of the Seven Mountains and politics being one of them. So Trump is their boy that's going to get us in power. And he's going to say this later on. This is not really about Christianity. This is not about Christ. This is about having power in America. That's what it's about. And quite frankly, it's what it's always been about.
And this becomes part of this groundswell of prophecies around Donald Trump. Now, as you go through the 2016 campaign, most of the evangelical leaders, the first, second, and third quadrant evangelical leaders, don't want to touch Donald Trump with a 10-foot pole. Right? He's uncouth. He's been married 3 times. He doesn't even know 2 Corinthians versus 2 Corinthians. Right? They find him very offensive. But it's the fourth quadrant leaders, the televangelists, the apostles, the messianic rabbis, the prophets, the megachurch pastors who are endorsing Trump and vouching for him.
A lot of false teachers in that quadrant, just FYI.
Under the guidance and leadership of Paula White-Cain. And as we get into the 2016 primary and then campaign, in February of 2016, Peter Wagner, hearing from Lance Wallnau about these ideas and prophecies about Trump, Peter Wagner endorses Donald Trump. For the first time he's ever done this in a presidential primary, he endorses a candidate. He's also dying at the time as he endorses it. And so people are paying very close attention to what Wagner is saying on his deathbed. And Wallnau, in the lead up to the 2016 campaign or election, really just wagers huge on Trump. And he writes an entire book where he's prophesying that Donald Trump will be the president, or at least is God's candidate to be the president.
And real quick on that, see, again, God's president to be the God's candidate to be the president. But again, that's Peter Wagner on his deathbed. He was the basically founder or one of the fathers of the 7 Mountain Mandate, right? So on his deathbed, he's basically saying, oh, yeah, this is what's going to happen. So this kind of thing took off.
He talks about Donald Trump conquering the government mountain, and he really goes heavy on this. And right before he dies in October of 2016, Peter Wagner casts his absentee ballot for Donald Trump. And after he dies, his family posts this on Facebook. And his followers see this as another prophecy from Peter Wagner, a kind of final prophecy from Peter Wagner about Donald Trump. Now, of course, Donald Trump wins unexpectedly in the 2016 election. And almost immediately, the NAR kicks into high gear. So as Trump is inaugurated in January of 2017, these NAR leaders organize a big gala dinner called the Christian Inaugural Ball, where they are the keynoters, and they represent this ascendant new class of the religious right. And as Trump and the Trump administration sweep into DC, the NAR stand up a whole spiritual warfare campaign on behalf of Donald Trump as the new president. They call it POTUS Shield. POTUS is President of the United States. And this is in order to protect Donald Trump from these spiritual forces that are coming against him. And they're saying Donald Trump is God's candidate. We need to support him with prayer. But tacitly and behind the scenes, what's going on here is they're also baptizing Trump's agenda as God's agenda. And to oppose Trump is to oppose God and support the cause of demons.
Sound familiar? Sound familiar? There you go. This was all started back in 2016, guys. Sound familiar, does it? Now, granted, this is not me, advocating for the Democrats because they got sin and they got all kinds of crap and garbage too. Don't get me wrong. I cannot stand their policies either. Well, as far as the the abortion and just we all know about all that. Okay, so I'm not for any of that. So this is not me, swinging to them. No, I think both parties are in sin. They both need to repent. And they both cannot save America. It's just FYI. But I think it's very funny or interesting, at least, how this got started in America with Trump. Basically, anybody who opposes Trump is automatically like demon possessed, if you will, because he's God's candidate. And what he's going to say here, basically, that means all his policies then by default have to be godly policies. Therefore, since they're coming from God's candidate, his policies therefore must be godly too, because this is what God wants, because he's God's candidate. That's kind of how this thing evolved,
right? So they're sacralizing the agenda of the Trump administration, and over the course of the Trump administration,
sacralizing the Trump administration is what he's doing. Did you hear that word? Sacralizing, make it basically, the sacrament. They're sacralizing what Trump is doing. That's huge, guys. That is huge.
Some of these NAR leaders become very, very important, official and unofficial Trump advisors. And Paula White Cain becomes chair of Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. And if you look at the lists of Trump's advisory boards, his evangelical advisory boards, at least half of every one of them have been independent charismatics. So you have this group of independent charismatics moving from the margins of American Christianity and becoming central players in the religious right through their proximity to Donald Trump. And the NAR is central to that. As the Trump administration goes on, this is where we get this genre of these photos.
See, NAR is central to that. New Apostolic Reformation, guys.
Of Trump with NAR leaders almost always front and center. In many of these photos, what is actually happening is people are prophesying over Trump. And these prophecies, like the one that Wallnau gave about Cyrus, begin to accumulate over the course of the Trump administration. By 2020, there are hundreds of these charismatic prophecies about Donald Trump. And as this is going on, the NAR leaders are also continuing to build this spiritual warfare fervor around Donald Trump. In fact, when Donald Trump, during his first term, is doing sensitive nuclear negotiations with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Mike Pence has Dutch Sheets and Paula White Cain and Cindy Jacobs and all these people lead a prayer call on behalf of the White House. And they're tapping into these NAR prayer and spiritual warfare networks, all tied now to the Trump administration. In November of 2019, Paula White Cain becomes an official White House employee. And one of the first things she does, just a few days after she gets into that role, is she convenes a planning meeting for what they call the One Voice Prayer Movement, a hyper-partisan prayer movement coordinated out of the White House by NAR leaders to help Trump win in 2020. And so you have NAR leaders like Dutch Sheets and Cindy Jacobs being invited into the White House about a year out from the presidential election in 2020. As we get into 2020, again, you have hundreds of these prophecies that are building and surrounding Trump. And all these prophecies are saying that Donald Trump is God's choice to win the 2020 election. In October of 2020, Donald Trump is campaigning in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he goes to an NAR church called the International Church of Las Vegas. And the NAR apostle, first the prophets in the congregation prophesy over Trump. And then during his sermon, the NAR apostle gets up and he holds up an appeal to heaven flag. And he says, I saw this sign of victory over the White House. This is a sign we're summoning the angels of heaven for you, Mr. President. And there's a photo that's snapped of him holding the appeal to heaven flag with Donald Trump in the foreground. And that photo goes viral on charismatic social media. And it's just a few days after this visit to the International Church of Las Vegas, after these prophecies and this appeal to heaven sermon, that Donald Trump changes his official religious identity from being a Presbyterian to being a non-denominational Christian. He's responding to these folks. He is interacting with their claims. Now, when Donald Trump loses the 2020 election and refuses to concede, these NAR leaders launch a massive spiritual warfare campaign in order to see these prophecies fulfilled. And Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau are the two of the most prominent in leading this, and they're on every podcast and every televangelism show they can go on. But it's also Cindy Jacobs and Che On and Chuck Pierce. Really, all of Wagner's inner circle are helping to drive this narrative that Donald Trump is the prophesied president, and we need to support him and stand with him.
And this is scary, like Cindy Jacobs and a lot of them guys he mentioned. Wow, some of the most false teachers out there, guys.
And over that span from November of 2020 through January 6th, they start building this crescendo, this fervor. We need to fulfill the prophecies. We need to do spiritual warfare. Trump is God's chosen candidate. And they start.
Real quick, on the bottom right here, that's Jonathan Cahn. He's got some of the weirdest stuff out there about basically how he basically parallels biblical Israel to America. And basically all these things are going to happen in America because they happen in Israel. So he just automatically like copies and pastes the history of Israel and puts it on America as if this is God's will or this is God's plan for America. So it's not even like America is the new Israel. It's like whatever happened for Israel will happen for us. It's a really, really weird spin on his biblical prophecy of how America is somehow the chosen nation of how all this is going to happen. You know, like how it happened for Israel, it's going to happen for us. It's really, really weird.
Are organizing a series of marches called the Jericho marches, many of them in the swing state capitals, but the main one culminates in Washington, D.C. on December 12th of 2020. And Lance Wallnau and Cindy Jacobs both speak at the Jericho March in Washington, D.C. Also, Jonathan Cahn, a very prominent Messianic rabbi, gives the keynote address at the Jericho March in Washington, D.C. And then just a couple weeks after that, about 8 days out from January 6th, on December 29th, 2020, Dutch Sheets leads a team of apostles and prophets for a 2-hour White House meeting with undisclosed White House administration officials. I've never been able to figure out exactly who was meeting with them in the White House, but these NAR leaders come out of this White House meeting, which is well documented. There's all kinds of photo evidence of them being there. And they come out and they're saying, we were talking strategy with people in the know at the highest levels of the US government. As we get closer and closer to January 6th, on the eve of January 6th, on January 5th, there's a big rally in Washington, D.C. as part of the beginning festivities around January 6th. It's called the Rally for Revival. Che On, this mentee of Peter Wagner's, speaks at this January 5th rally in Washington, D.C., and he issues an apostolic declaration of prophecy where he says, we are going to rule and reign through President Trump under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And
there it is. There it is. Did you hear that? We are going to rule and reign. We, being Christians, are going to rule and reign under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So Jesus is just an ends to a means how we Christians can dominate and be in control. We, the Christians, are going to rule and reign America. That's what this whole thing is about. It's not about Christ at all. Christ is just the vehicle by which they use to gain power. But ultimately, this is about money and having power and control. That's what this thing is all about. It's never been about Christ. Christ is just the name that they spew to get what they want. Ultimately, this is about them seizing power. That's what this is about.
This becomes then kind of part of the iconography of January 6th in these charismatic circles. And that rally goes on for about 8 hours. The first half is mostly charismatic pastors like Che On speaking. The second half is people like Michael Flynn and Alex Jones and Roger Stone speaking. Right? So you see this blending of the Trump inner circle with these kind of NAR leaders. And then on January 6th, I have tracked at least 60 independent charismatic Christian leaders who were in Washington, D.C. for January 6th. They believed it was a day when they had to do spiritual warfare. Most of them were joining the crowds surrounding the Capitol. At least 7 of these folks faced criminal prosecution for their participation that day. And these folks range from local pastors to global celebrity prophets with millions of followers. And at least 5 members of Peter Wagner's inner circle are there in the crowns on January 6th.
5 members of Peter Wagner's, again, he's the 7 Mountain Mandate guy. At least 5 people from his inner circle were there during the January 6th insurrection. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Because again, they believe Trump is God's secular Messiah that's going to issue in a new rule and reign for Christians in America. That's what this whole thing is about. And the 7 Mountain Mandates, it's about deboing people who aren't Christians. That's what it's about.
One of the beliefs in these circles is that the shofar, this ram's horn that comes from Jewish liturgical usage.
Here you go. I've seen this in so many churches too. So many churches blow the shofar because we're going to spiritual warfare, and so we got to blow the Jewish shofar. I've been in, I can't say many, but I've been in a couple of churches where they've done this, and it's just, it makes my head hurt. But yeah, I've seen this done before.
Is a weapon of spiritual warfare. And this is why you see the shofar all over the place around the Capitol riot. In fact, if you look at the picture here of these 2 women, one of them is caught on video going up to the broken out windows of the Capitol, blowing the shofar into the broken out windows. Again, this is about spiritual warfare. That's the
blowing the shofar in the broken windows. Why don't they repent and pray for the people who are getting hurt? Are you serious? Are you serious? But he just showed video evidence of it, guys. This is This is sick.
Purpose. We also that day see groups of Christians gathering during the riot, sometimes just yards away from where people are actively beating Capitol police officers, singing worship songs. Again, as participation in spiritual warfare. This is spiritual warfare practices. This is independent charismatic spirituality on display around the riot. Cindy Jacobs and Becca Greenwood. Again, Becca Greenwood, who was there on January, or excuse me, at the Operation Ice Castle. They are outside the Capitol prophesying and praying, and they even have Dutch Sheets come in on conference call around this group. In the middle of the riot, this is all going on with the NAR leaders. Lance Wallnau was scheduled to speak at a January 6th rally. There were several rallies scheduled for around the Capitol. The one at 1 p.m. outside the U.S. Capitol that was canceled because of the rioting. Well, Lance Wallnau was supposed to speak there alongside Marjorie Taylor Greene and Roger Stone and Lauren Boebert, right? These are the circles they are traveling in. And because that one gets canceled, he goes back to his Trump International hotel room on January 6th and live broadcasts on this Flashpoint Spiritual Warfare and Prophecy show, all talking about January 6th and the riot at the Capitol. On January 6th, we see these appeal to heaven flags everywhere in the crowds. There's dozens, maybe even hundreds of them. We see them when the crowds are gathering at the Trump rally, at the Ellipse. We see them around the Washington Monument as the crowds are moving across the mall towards the Capitol. We see them on the front lines as the crowd is skirmishing with the Capitol police officers. We know of at least one rioter who wore an appeal to heaven flag as a cape into the Capitol. And when the FBI later went to arrest him, they found the appeal to heaven flag in his home. It was spattered with blood and with mace from the riot. After January 6th, these NAR leaders don't drop this. They come to believe that Donald Trump is still God's chosen candidate. And they keep pushing for Trump to be restored.
Which is why, by the way, when Trump lost in 2020, you had people like, and I talked about this before, you had people like Lance Wallnau saying, well, the reason Trump lost was because you Christians voted for the wrong person. So not that any of my prophecies was wrong, not that any of our people got it wrong. No, you got it wrong because you Christians didn't do your job. And that is why you had people like Chris Valentin from Bethel Supernatural School of Ministry, because again, they're an NAR church. He prophesied falsely that Trump was going to win in 2020. Now, granted, he came back later and he apologized and said, look, y'all, I missed it, blah, blah, blah. But my point is, and I believe what Dr. Matthew Taylor is pointing out, there's a reason why they said Trump was going to win in 2020, because they firmly believe that he's God's chosen candidate and he's their secular Messiah. So it's more than just they believe that. This is also what they want, because, again, they believe he's going to usher in the 7 Mountain Mandate. So that's why Chris Valentin and also Jeremiah Johnson, he did the same thing. Jeremiah Johnson's good friends with these guys. He had to come back and apologize and repent of his false prophecy too. And it's like, look, I missed it. Yeah, you missed it because your whole theology on this whole thing is whack. So the Chris Valentins and the Jeremiah Johnsons, they had to come back and say, look, y'all, we missed it. But I'm like, yeah, you missed it because this wasn't of God. This is what you want or wanted because of your bad theology. And again, then people like, instead of saying, hey, we missed it, the Lance Wallnaus of the world said, no, you Christians are to blame. That's why he didn't get reelected in 2020.
As Trump goes into the wilderness after January 6th, as there's these questions of whether he has any political future, the NAR leaders stick strong with him. And these prophecies around Donald Trump continue to flow, and they continue to talk about him as this figure of prophecy. In fact, at one point, Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau and these other Flashpoint leaders gather a group in Georgia, a group of about 10,000 people, and they all together say this Watchman decree that Dutch Sheets wrote. And this is just a portion of it. Whereas we, the church, are God's governing body on the earth, we've been given legal power from heaven and now exercise our authority. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. We will never stop fighting. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. And this,
because it's about your power. See, did you hear all that? We have authority. We are going to take our dominion back. It's all about power, guys. And it even said 7 Mountain Mandate. That's what all this is about.
This is the message that begins to build after January 6th in the lead up to the 2024 election. We continue to see after January 6th, these appeal to heaven flags proliferating all over the place. We've seen them in neo-Nazi groups in Oregon and New England. They've started to fly the appeal to heaven flag. We see them at Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito's summer vacation home in the Jersey Shore. We blame it on his wife. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, flies an appeal to heaven flag outside of his congressional office. And when my colleague Brad Onishi and I exposed this on Rolling Stone in November of 2023, we reached out to Johnson's office, and he said that they got the flag from an NAR pastor, and he just appreciates it for the history. Donald Trump himself has leaned into these prophecy narratives in recent years. He's begun to embrace these prophecy narratives. He's retweeted this AI-generated image of himself at the defense table alongside Jesus. He has been telling Christians about how they won't have to vote anymore if they just vote for him this election. He'll take care of everything. It's kind of apocalyptic, messianic promise. He has really especially leaned into the narratives about the assassination attempts on him, claiming that he was saved by divine providence, saved to save America, right? This very messianic claim. In the 2024 campaign, the NAR leaders actively campaigned for Donald Trump. In fact, Lance Wallnau led a swing state revival tour. It was claimed to be a revival tour. In reality, it was a political and voter mobilization tour. They only went to the swing states. The whole day program was about Trump and conspiracy theories and political mobilization. In fact, at one of these stops, and I was there, Lance Wallnau said January 6th was not an insurrection. It was an election fraud intervention. And at another one of these stops,
wow, election fraud, or insurrection, not an insurrection. Wow.
Pennsylvania, J.D. Vance joined the Lance Wallnau Roadshow to live cast a town hall meeting from Lance Wallnau's tour in order to give Lance Wallnau a pat on the back. The NAR leaders in the lead up to the 2024 election held huge prayer.
Real quick, I'm going to go back and I'm going to find that video of Lance Wallnau basically saying Trump is going to usher in the new third wave or the third revival. I have that in my Lance Wallnau video. I'm going to include that in the description of this video.
Prayer events on the National Mall, including this one called the Million Women March, that again, I was there, and it went on for about 10 hours that day. All the NAR core leaders were there. It was right in front of the National Mall. There were between 50 and 100,000 people there. Very multi-ethnic crowd. And at this gathering, you had Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets and Cheon and Lou Engle. And Cheon got up to give another apostolic declaration. And this is what he said. Trump.
Lou Engle, too, man. He's had some marches in D.C. And, yeah, Lou Engle, he's had some weird stuff, too, just FYI.
Trump is a type of Jehu, and Kamala Harris is a type of Jezebel. And I decree it by faith that Trump will win on November the 5th. He will be our 47th president, and Kamala Harris will be cast down. She will lose in Jesus' mighty name. If you know anything about the story he's referring to, this is one of the most brutal stories in the entire Hebrew Bible, about where they are using this typology to say Kamala Harris is Jezebel, who is this famously wicked queen in the Hebrew Bible, and Donald Trump is Jehu. And Jehu is the anointed king who slaughters Jezebel. Brutal story. This is in 1 Kings chapter 9. So this is the imagery that you're leading into the election with.
No, I find it interesting, and I can't even use the word funny because it's not funny. It's the wrong word. Ironic, maybe, or hypocritical, or it just shows how depraved these false prophecies are. Because remember in 2016, they said, no, Trump is the Cyrus. But then he loses in 2020. So now in 2024, no, he's not the Cyrus anymore. He's now Jehu. It's funny how you change your prophecies to fit your narrative. Are y'all seeing that? How the prophecies changed when he lost in 2020? So in 2024, he can't be the Cyrus. Apparently, he's got to be somebody else. So now he's Jehu. It's so convenient how these prophecies just flip-flop whenever it needs to fit their narrative. It's so bad, guys.
Remember that photo from October 23rd, 2024? Well, there is Cheon, and Lance Wallnau was there in the crowd as well, with hands directly on Donald Trump. This is after he's made this very violent declaration about Trump is a Jehu, and then a few days later, he has his hand right on Trump's shoulder. At that gathering, just a few days later, Jonathan Cahn got up. This is, again, this photo from October of 2024. Jonathan Cahn got up and issued a prophecy over Donald Trump. And this is what he said. He was the one from the Jericho March, the keynote speaker. And he said, Mr. President, I speak of the mystery of your life. God called you to walk according to the template of Jehu. Jehu came to the capital city with an agenda to drain the swamp. Jehu was born to make his nation great again by turning it back to God. If you go and read that story in 2 Kings chapter 10, what is the template of Jehu? Jehu slaughters all the family of Ahab and Jezebel. That's what this drain the swamp is about. And he piles the heads of their children up at the city gates as a warning. This is the violent imagery. Note, Jonathan Cahn is not saying, hey, I noticed some interesting parallels between Donald Trump and this Jehu figure. He's saying this is a script. This is a template that Donald Trump has to follow. Donald Trump has to live out the violence of Jehu.
Which makes sense because, again, the same Jonathan Cahn, he basically says, how these prophecies of Israel is modern day America and how modern day America is going to fulfill the same thing. He has this weird parallel like universe of how somehow America, he infuses that into the Bible and how these Jehu stories or whatever is what's happening now in America. He's been doing this now for decades. He's been doing this a while now. But it's just weird how he infuses America into the history of Israel and how we are going to do the same in America, do the same thing. So it doesn't surprise me that he's doing this Jehu bit.
This was the message the NAR leaders were promoting in the lead up to this election, telling their followers, conditioning their followers that Donald Trump has to be violent. That is his role. Okay, we're almost to the end. Just about a month and a half ago, these leaders gathered once again around Donald Trump in early February, and Donald Trump, on the same day that these folks gathered around him in the White House.
So this is February 2025. So this is like 2 months ago.
For this photo op. And there's Paula White-Cain in the white dress at the center. Trump announced that Paula White-Cain would lead his new White House Faith Office, giving her an even higher profile than she has ever had in the administration. And he also announced through an executive order a new task force.
And by the way, I did a video on that and Paula White and that whole thing.
For, quote, eradicating anti-Christian bias. Not eradicating anti-Semitism, not eradicating Islamophobia, two forms of religious bias that are rampant in our society today, especially as this war is going on between Israel and Gaza. But no, this is about eradicating anti-Christian bias. Christians make up 2/3 of the country. There is no widespread anti-Christian bias. But this is part of the agenda of Christian supremacy. And this task force is to be led out of the Department of Justice. So it has real legal power behind it. So as we conclude, remember what I said early on. Religious movements that threaten democracy are those that privilege one religious community and their citizenship over other communities and their citizenship, like eradicating anti-Christian bias, but not anti-Semitic or anti-secular or Islamophobic bias. There's all kinds of religious bias in our country. Anti-Christian bias is not a real big one of them, right? And yet this is the focus. Using demonization.
That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does, but you got to understand what he's saying in context of the greater narrative. Christians, people do come against us legally, but again, we're not like, people that are getting martyred in other parts of the world, So again, context is key here. He's not saying Christian persecution doesn't happen. That's not what he's saying. Just keep that in mind.
And threats of violence to bring authoritarian leaders to power. Everything that we saw around January 6th was about the demonization of their enemies and about this authoritarian grasp for power. Baptizing an authoritarian agenda in theology to make it seem like it's God's agenda. And I will argue that we have never seen in American history this kind of religious fervor and messianic fervor around a national level political leader in American history. We're in a unique situation around this. So if we go back to our 4 quadrants model, I'd argue that the first quadrant, this kind of denominational, non-charismatic space, was this most institutionally hefty part of evangelicalism. That was the center of gravity of the religious right in the 1980s through the 2000s. What we're seeing in the last decade is that the 4th quadrant is the new center of gravity in the religious right in the Trump era, due to the influence of Paula White-Cain and the NAR. They're the ones who brokered this deal, built this team of religious leaders and propagandists around Donald Trump surrounded him with these advisors who are also selling him to Christians. All right, let me give 4 final thoughts, and then we'll have time for some questions. I don't think Donald Trump would be the president today without these Christian supremacist theologies, and especially these charismatic prophecies that have surrounded him with this aura, this spiritual aura.
Very interesting choice of words. These supremacist ideologies and these charismatic prophecies. Very, very interesting choice of words there. I also think he's right. Now, I don't know if he would have been president or not, but the supremacist ideologies and false teaching, false prophecies did a lot to do with it. They really did. They did help. And I also did a video on this too. He didn't even talk about in 2016 the support he had from Liberty University from Jerry Falwell Jr. and how Jerry Falwell Jr. used Liberty University to basically host, Trump's pep rallies and all this kind of stuff, and how he donated millions of dollars into the Trump campaign. That was Jerry Falwell Jr., the ex-president of Liberty University, who got caught in a sexual scandal himself and his wife. That's why they basically were forced out. He's no longer the president of Liberty University. But in 2016, how he was using all his money, however he got it, to fund Trump. So he didn't even talk about that.
And have sanctified him and made him into a quasi-messianic figure in the eyes of many Christians and many evangelicals and many other non-evangelical Christians in America. Think about Trump in these messianic terms. So in answer to our question, has evangelical Christianity become a threat to American democracy? I would say yes. Some very powerful and well-connected American evangelicals, not all, but some absolutely pose a profound threat to American democracy.
And I'm glad he said some. I'm glad he made that differentiation there.
They do not care about democracy. They care about enacting their religious agenda, bringing about the revival that they think God has destined and prophesied for America.
By the way, you can see this in also Christian nationalism. See, the Christian nationalists, they really just picked up on what they picked up what the NAR was putting down. So this whole Trump Messianic Messiah, our power control, this also gives birth to Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalists, believe it or not, they just picked up with the NAR, these false teachers and false prophets of the charismatic NAR movement. They just took their trash, picked it up, and ran with it. They just picked up what they were putting down. So this kind of stuff has led to Christian nationalism, which leads, or has led to supremacy, white supremacy, all this other kind of stuff is unfortunately mixed in with all this. And it's all being named via the name of Christ. It's all sin. It's all ungodly. It's all wrong.
And many other evangelicals and other American Christians contribute to this by supporting it, offering their unwavering support to Trump and MAGA. It's one thing to support a political candidate and have your reservations and to criticize and challenge. No one in this coalition is challenging Trump today. And what we're living through now is an almost unprecedentedly fast slide into illiberal democracy in the beginning of the Trump.
Now, when he says liberal here, he's not talking about the left or, Democrats. When he says liberal here, he's talking about liberties, freedoms, our rights. Okay. That's how he's using the term. He's not talking about, far left Democrat. He's talking about liberties, i.e. freedoms in our society. That's what he means by liberal here.
Trump administration. That is what has been playing out over the last 7 or 8 weeks. And the administration itself is stripping away the rule of law, the separation of powers, and free speech rights. And I would argue American democracy has never faced a greater crisis than what we are going through right now. It is an existential threat to American democracy, to American liberal democracy. We'll still have elections, ostensibly, but will they be free and fair? Will the rule of law persist? Those are the questions on the table right now. And so we need a broad-based resistance movement to this. We need secular and non-Christian and Christian people all to come together and to challenge this stuff right now. We need to stand against this if we're going to protect American democracy. But we also need a theological resistance movement because the propaganda itself is theological. And you aren't going to be able to.
Agreed. Completely agreed. It has this is their theological belief system. And so I agree with them. It does need to be challenged theologically. And I'm one of the ones and many other people on YouTube who are challenging it because I do not hold to this theology. I think it's whack theology. I think they're wrong. And it's given birth to a lot of wrong stuff. So I agree with him. It does need to be challenged theologically as well, not just politically, but theologically as well. Because theologically, spiritually, if you will, theologically bad doctrine is what's fueling this and has been fueling it ever since 2016.
To dispel it just by talking about human rights or the values of democracy, we need to have a theological argument in the United States today about how theology is being used to bolster authoritarianism.
And I'll stop there because then he goes into the Q&A, I believe. So, yeah, I agree. We do need to have a theological discussion about this. And I've tried to a little bit on my channel. I'll just give you some quick things on this before I get out of here. Again, like I said earlier, I am not left or right. I'm not Democrat, Republican. I'm a Christian. And I don't claim any party or affiliation. And I don't claim to in the future. I believe Jesus is Lord, and therefore Trump or anybody else cannot be. So I do not go left or right, Republican or Democrat or blue state, red state. I don't do any of that. I pledge allegiance to Jesus because he's my king and he's my Lord, and therefore Trump cannot be, or any Biden or Harris or anybody else for that matter. One thing I have found though is when I've said that on my channel, the extreme backlash that I've gotten from the Trumpers. I've been called pretty much everything except child of God from so-called Christians because I was coming up against their secular Cyrus, their secular Messiah. It's bad, which is why I agree with him. There does need to be a theological discussion about this. And it's just, and here's the other thing too. Here's the other thing too that I've experienced. When you talk about how there is white supremacy ideologies with some of this theology, and there is some racist stuff mixed in with this stuff. That's just a historical fact. That is a historical fact going all the way back to the Puritans, guys. Okay? Because the Puritans wanted America to be the new Israel. So this goes all the way back to that. And therefore, there was some white supremacist ideologies, therefore racism in that theology. It goes all the way back to the Puritans and all the way back to the 1700s. When I brought that history out, people accuse me of being woke now. Oh, I'm a social justice warrior and I'm woke. And it's none of that. I'm just calling out the sin for what it is. But because we're so categorized and we're so, polarized into one particular camp or the other camp, when you speak against a certain sin, they automatically label you as woke and you're a leftist and you're a socialist and you're not even American anymore. All because you speak against racism or something like that. Or you speak against racism in the church and racism ideologies, which again, this kind of stuff gives birth to that. So when you speak of that, they automatically label you as woke. You're a social justice warrior. You need to be removed from the pulpit because you're just one of them, race hustling pimps or what. I'm none of those things, but I am going to speak the truth in love and tell you what's going on. But because of the polarization and the lies, and people are not allowed to have discussions about this, because again, it's not just a political issue. This is a theological issue. He was absolutely right in saying that at the end. This is a theological issue. So when I try to bring this theology to the forefront, I get labeled as woke, and I've had people email me and come against me and misjudge me, and it's just been wrong. All right. It's just been wrong. And I'll just leave it at that. I love you. But you completely misjudge me on that. And I've had to take some heat over speaking the truth. And it's really sickening. I'm just sharing that from my heart. Okay. But I wanted you to see today, as far as Trump anyway, that this started back in 2016. And it started with Paula White and her NAR friends, and then Lance Wallnau and this whole thing, and Peter Wagner and the 7 Mountain Mandates. And again, Bill Johnson from Bethel Supernatural School Ministry and his boy, Chris Valentin, and all that, they're all NAR. Okay. So that's why they wanted him to win in 2020, because that's what they believe Trump is going to usher us into the grand dominion control of America. That's what they believe, and that's what they want. But it's not about Christ. It's about power and control and having dominion. And apparently, I guess, Debo anybody who ain't. So I think this guy, Matthew D. Taylor, does a great job of showing us all that and basically walking the timeline from 2016 until now, February of 2025, of how we got here where we are now, and showing the false prophecies of Cyrus. And then now in 2024, Trump's a Jehu, how the prophecies changed to fit their narrative. I think he did a great job of showing us all that. So I applaud Matthew D. Taylor, and I applaud the brother there for interviewing him and showing him. I'm going to give you the link to his book. Again, I've not read the book, so I can't recommend it or not recommend it. I'm just saying that particular 25-minute clip or so that I showed in the interview, I thought was very, very good. All right. So it does show and it does walk the dog theologically how we got to where we are. It really, really, really does. And it's eye-opening, particularly the January 6th insurrection. Boy, that was eye-opening. Blowing the shofar in the broken window. I mean, that's sick. That is really sick. So anyway, as always, hit the like button. And I know I'm going to get some political feedback on this. This is not a political post. Politics are involved, but it's really a theology post because it's talking about theology of the 7 mountain mandates and how they believe theology is supposed to dominate and rule politics. So it becomes a political post, but ultimately it's a theological post of the NAR. That's why it says how Paula White, Lance Wallnau, and the NAR denomination hijacked the White House. And they pretty much did. And that's what the guy's saying. That fourth quadrant, that's what he's talking about. They pretty much did. And that fourth quadrant of these false prophets and false teachers and whack jobs, they're the ones giving Trump his spiritual advisement right now. That fourth quadrant of whack jobs are what's in the White House now, guys. Well, they've been there since 2016, but they're back in there again since Paula White's now in charge of the faith office, whatever that is. So that's where we are. That's where we are. And I believe pastors need to start calling this out. Some of them have. But I think a lot more need to, because that's what's in the White House right now. And these whack jobs are hijacking for their own gain and their own power based upon their own whack theology. Amen. So again, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. Until next time, know that God loves you 92. God bless everybody.